And but she says that I didn't even realize that I was up to number 25. And if you look at a writer's work and you think like so many titles, how did this writer come to so many titles? Well, it can't be very serious work, a la authors who churn out a book a year or a book every couple of years. So she says, but that seems to be what happened. And it's interesting that she says that because the seriousness of her fiction is a topic that's been it's bothered critics for decades. If you go back and you read reviews of her books, most of them are very favorable, but a few of them will say, well, she writes, what's that word it's a bit of a put down for women writing, domestic fiction. So when women write about home and family and relationships, it's domestic fiction, and it's in the snooty book reviewing world, it's looked down upon. But when a man writes, and she says here, so the seriousness of her fiction, which includes much loved novels such as Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant, The Accidental Tourist, that one you probably remember because that one that was the one that was made into a film, right? That was a really good film. Again, that was a number of years ago. And her Pulitzer Prize winning book, Breathing Lessons, which was a look at marriage and family and relationships, which is what her books are about, because basically that's what life is about. And that's what she says she writes about. But this, whether her fiction is to be taken seriously or not, has bothered critics for decades. How could a writer of such witty, warm, kind novels about middle-class family that contain very little historical context. So this is interesting because historical fiction is a very popular genre. It's always been, and now particularly it seems to be. No politics, and on purpose she says she doesn't put politics. She doesn't put sex into her books as well. And she does that on purpose in an interview, well, on purpose, but in an interview, the interviewer, and it was a man who was interviewing her, and he said to her at one point, I noticed, and then he wants to ask this question, but he didn't know how to ask this question. I noticed that, you don't write anything about sex in your stories. And she said, no, because it makes me uncomfortable and I don't write about it. And that was the end of the subject. So no, and no politics and no history. And so how could a writer like this be considered one of, and really be one of America's finest living novelists, as so many have claimed? Not to mention the number of her books, how she writes, and the prodigiousness of her work. This is her 25th book. The author herself is confident enough that she doesn't really care. She is unswayed by literary fashion or criticism, and she says she writes the novels that interest her. She writes about things that interest her. She doesn't care what's popular, whether you have to put this into your book or you have to put that into your book, as many authors do. Because, when you think of modern fiction, there is not so much that is like hers. Not so much of contemporary fiction and best-selling contemporary novels that don't contain any politics, that don't contain any, that are not historical fiction, that don't have sex scenes, like many of them or not, or few of them, but nothing at all. And as I said, but she writes what interests her, and her devoted readership, which I must confess, I count myself among her devoted readership. For the last, she's been writing for 60 years. And she says, how we human beings handle day-to-day life as we go through it with its disappointments and its pleasures, that's all I want to write about. That's all I want to know. And she was interviewed. She granted an interview to this reporter from The Guardian. She just turned 84 years old, and she lives now, I thought this was interesting, she just moved to a Quaker retirement community outside of Baltimore. That's where her late parents had retired, and by chance, she moved into the house next door from where her parents used to live a couple of years ago. She grew up, I don't know if you remember, those of you who know about her, because I remember reading about her years ago. She was born in Minnesota in October 1941, but she grew up in Quaker communes in Minnesota, and then her parents moved to North Carolina, and that's where she grew up. She was 11 years old when she first attended school, like a real school. Until then, she had been homeschooled. She's the oldest of four. She had three younger brothers. And she says it was a big shock to her. I remember reading this over in interviews, articles about her in interviews when I would read up on different books. And she always said that going to school was a real shock for her because, until 11, she lived in these Quaker community places, and her mother was her teacher. And then she went to school, and she says, I remember I was 11 years old and I went to school and I was wearing my nice little like Quaker girl dresses that my mother had made for me. And I thought they were so beautiful. And there were these girls and they were looking at me. And of course, I stood out and I was very odd. And not just that I was new, but I looked so different. And she said, they weren't mean. They just came all stood around me in a group and looked at me in some interesting, new, strange phenomenon. And they said to me, so do you have a boyfriend? And she said, a boyfriend? I'm 11 years old. And they said, yeah, so do you have a boyfriend? And she said, that's when I realized this was going to be a very different world than what I had been used to. Clearly, she is very bright because she adapted. She won a scholarship to university when she was 16 years old. So she went and she did that, and she left her Quaker surroundings. But she said that she thinks that that was part of what helped her become a novelist because she grew up in this very different setting and she observed, and she was homeschooled and she had to be on her own a lot. She says, from a very early age, I started to write and I knew that I wanted to write. She says she considers herself a secular Quaker, by the way. She doesn't, because in her books, she doesn't put religion in very much, at least not, it's no main thing for her. She says, and she enjoys very much where she lives now. She lived in Baltimore for many, many years. And those of you who've read her books know that they are by far, I think almost all of them set in Baltimore. And she says, that's where I live, that's where I'm comfortable, that's what I can write about. If I would write about another place, then I would have to do research. And I don't really like to do research. So she says, so I set it in Baltimore and in the neighborhoods that I know, so I get things right, so I don't have to check that if I would set it in another city, that I have to get the streets right and I have to get just everything right. So that's where, sorry?
Was she ever married?
Yes, I'm gonna come to that. Yeah, she was married. She was married actually to an Iranian psychiatrist. She has two daughters and she lived in Montreal for a brief period of time. I remember reading that many years ago when we started to do her books. She came to McGill. I think her husband was studying. She met her husband there when she lived actually she was living in North Carolina at the time. And she went to Duke University and she studied Russian. She said that was the most rebellious thing I could think to do when I was 16 years old and won this scholarship to university. So I studied Russian and she became a Russian bibliographer. And that's what she did. She worked at McGill at the library as a Russian bibliographer for the couple of years that she was here with her husband. Her husband died in 1997 of lymphoma, so she's been a widow for many years. But yes, she was married and very happily married. There's one of her books, and I have to look up the title, which we read, and I think we talked about, and it's about a couple, and they adopt an Iranian child. And so she has a lot of descriptions about Iranian families in America. She said that comes from her husband and from her in-laws. But generally, she says, I don't put myself into my books. She says, so she lived in the Roland Park, I don't know Baltimore, but the Roland Park neighborhood of Baltimore, and where she sets most of her novels. She, as this interviewer of The Guardian says, when she looks almost exactly the same as when we met 13 years ago, except that her trademark, she always has had the same hairstyle. If you look at pictures of her, she has bangs and her hair is usually up in a bun. Her hair was going silver gray over the years, and now it's white. So the interviewer says there. So that seems to be the only thing. And I feel very lucky that I'm being able to interview her again, because when I interviewed her those 13 years ago, she hadn't done an interview in many years. She was often referred to, as I said before, like a J.D. Salinger-like recluse. And on one occasion, she was called the Greta Garbo of the literary world. And yet, when you speak to her, it's hard to imagine anybody less prickly. She has the softest Southern accent and she smiles with her whole face. She says she's getting a little bit more used to doing interviews, but she still finds them a bit uncomfortable, she feels. If I talk about writing, I can't do writing for some time afterward. I'm too self-conscious, she says. I think I'm shy, to be honest. I hate to admit it as a grown-up, but there we are. She's a very unassuming person. She says some of her friends don't even know that she's a writer. When she downsized from her house to this retirement house now, she did not even keep a copy of any of her own books. What would I do with them? She says, this is interesting. She says, I have them all on a Kindle, but the only time I go back to them is to check to see if I'm repeating myself. But otherwise, she says, I got rid of almost everything, most of my kitchen utensils. She says, I'm very proud to say there's no clutter in my house. Both of her daughters are artists. And so the only things she has room for on the walls now in this very small house is her daughter's art. She says, and I don't know if anybody if you've read anything about her, one of the things that was never in danger of being culled when she downsized was her famous blue box. And she says, when she's asked, what gives you inspiration? So she has this blue box, and she said it was an index, a box that just used for index cards for recipes. And that was her original blue box. So she says, my first novel, which was published in 1964 when she was 22 years old, and she says, I wish I could just throw out any copies that exist of my first 4 novels because they were really not very good. But anyway, she said, 1964, I just double checked that date because it was so long ago that I thought maybe I had it wrong. And my most recent book is published now in 2025. So this means that my index card box, where all my books originate, I'm just telling you about this because it's just interesting, like how an author gets her ideas. And here she is at 80, she was 83 when 3 Days in June was published, still writing, not writing any historical fiction, not doing anything with research, telling stories about people, and it's her 25th book. So where does she get her ideas from? She says it's from this box. This first started out as a little metal box, the kind you found in most kitchens, maybe pre-internet days where you don't maybe have recipe books or boxes of recipe cards anymore. And I repainted it royal blue to cover up the word recipes. But eventually my stash of index cards outgrew it. And what does this box contain? Plot ideas, possible titles, a snatch of mysterious dialogue overheard while grocery shopping. Finally, I had to buy a bigger box. This one is 12 inches long and made of black and white speckled cardboard. But she says, the label that I put into the brass frame on the front of this box reads Blue Box for continuity's sake. And there was an interview with her on CBS, I think Sunday morning program, and she's sitting there with the interviewer again, another interview. So this is really something, a change for her. And this box is sitting on the kitchen table. And the interviewer says to her, so your famous blue box, which is black and white now, show us how this works. And she says, well, my procedure is when I begin a novel, first of all, is to go through that box. First, not second. I don't first get an idea and then consult my index cards to flesh it out. Instead, I start with nothing but the vague sense, and this is really interesting, the vague sense that I really would feel happier to be writing a novel right now, except I don't have the slightest notion what that novel would be about. So isn't that interesting? Because usually authors will say, well, I got this idea, I had this idea, and that was the germ of an idea, and that's how I started writing my book. So she says, no. I just feel, okay, it's time, like it's time to write another book. And then I go to my box and I see, okay, now I feel like I'm in the mood to start a book. So what shall I write it about? And so I plow through the cards from front to back. Some are more than 60 years old. And while I may have passed up a certain card repeatedly over the decades, this time I'll pause and think, wait, and I pluck it out. I'll end up with maybe 10 or 20 cards, some of which eventually will go back into the box. Others stay out. Who can say why or what makes me feel that I can use those now when I couldn't use them earlier? The weird thing is, she continues, that often after I've written a book, I'll glance back at some crucial index card and find almost no connection between that card and the final product. For instance, 3 days in June, what would you think it took, when she took her idea from? Somebody's wedding that she went to, I don't know, somebody that's sunny weather, I don't know. So you think something like that. And she says, but no, listen to this. It took shape from a card reading, bossy aunt introduces awkward niece to equally awkward son of a friend. And niece realizes he's awkward because he doesn't really care about other people, nor does she, written in big letters. Well, there's no bossy aunt character in 3 Days in June, and there's no awkward son of a friend. And while my central character does seem a bit blunt at times, she clearly cares about other people. So how did we get from that card to this book? The fact is, I suspect, continues Ann Tyler, that the purpose of my index cards is to remind me that the outside of my office, which, by the way, these days, my office is my kitchen table and a stack of paper and a particular pen. So she is one of these authors, A, who writes in longhand, and B, who has a thing that has to be a certain kind of pen, a uniball pen, she says. Used to be, she says, a fountain pen, but her fingers were always covered in ink. So one of her fans from Japan sent her a whole collection of different kinds of pens, and this is the one that she decided is the best one. So there was a change. That's the only change. But so that's her. So she says, I think that really the purpose of these index cards is to remind me that outside my kitchen, there are endless possibilities for human interaction. No two marriages are the same. No two parent-child relationships, no friendships. I might open that box convinced that however much I'd like to be writing, I have nothing anymore to write about. But then the cards are sort of jumping up and down and vying for my attention. And all of a sudden I feel rich. So that's how she gets going. And that's how she gets her ideas, which is really very interesting. And there's a scene near the end of 3 Days in June where the two middle-aged characters, the two main characters who are a divorced, middle-aged couple named Gail and Max. How many of you read the book, by the way? Okay, good. So I think there are going to be spoiler alerts when I talk about it, but I'm sorry. I mean, it's not a mystery. It's just, I can't talk about it otherwise. So there are these two, they're a couple who've been divorced for a number of years, Max and Gail, and they compare their lives to the movie Groundhog Day, where people live through the same day over and over until they get it right. Gail reminds her ex-husband Max. Wouldn't it be great if the world worked that way, says Max. Instead, what Tyler's novels do is they record the numerous ways people get things wrong. And since they can't go back and relive things, because this is not a movie, they learn to live with it, and how sometimes, even if the things that they did were wrong, they do have a possibility of turning out to be right at some point. And that's what happens in this book. So you have, what is the setting of the book? 3 Days in June. It's a small book, 176 pages. You could, I mean, I guess you could even, I don't know what novella length is defined as, but it's a short novel. And it takes place over 3 days in June. It's a weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And these 3 days, so the focus is Max and Gail's daughter Debbie is getting married. So the first section of the first act of the play almost is the Friday before the wedding, the day of the wedding, and then the Sunday, the day after the wedding. And those are the 3 sections of the book. And you read the book, you could read it if you have a nice long afternoon, you could read it in an afternoon or read it in 2 sittings. And you think, oh, what a nice little book. But when you go back and you look at it, which I do when I'm preparing, which is really a benefit of having to prepare, you realize that one of Anne Tyler's great talents is her ability to write these books that seem so effortless. There's no fancy prose, there are not too many adjectives and not too many adverbs, which, as I always say, is my personal preference. She chooses her words with great care, and she doesn't always write such short books. She has other books that are quite a bit longer. This is one of the shortest ones that she's written in a while. But she puts so much into these 3 days, into this small book. You get a picture of her characters, which some of the readers, because I go on to Goodreads and see what people thought about it, complain that it's too short. She should have made it longer. They wanted to know more about the characters. And one of the readers said, and I'm hoping for a sequel, because how could she just end it like that? And that's one thing that Anne Tyler says again in another interview, that I don't do sequels ever. I never, because somebody asked her, do you go back? Would you go back to your characters? And she says, no, once I finish with them, that's it. That's the end of them. And I don't go back. I just leave it where it is. Because she says, what makes me want to keep going as a writer, which she says maybe it's a selfish motive, is that I always want to know what it's like to be somebody else. I feel greedy and I wish that I had more than one life. And she said, so now she just turned 84, which she was saying this was like a few months ago, she was 83. And she says, I will continue to listen, to think, and to write as long as I am able to. And her subject really is everyday life. So it's marriage, it's families, it's relationships between people, between spouses and children, and just people in general. She's a very astute observer of human nature. In the Jane Austen, if you think of it tradition, and Jane Austen, of course, is one of her favorite writers. And Jane Austen also famously, she didn't put politics into her book. I mean, all kinds of stuff are read into her books, when people study literature and study Jane Austen. But she had her little domestic fiction, and she wrote about families, and she wrote about daughters having to be married off, and mothers wanting to marry their daughters off, in relationships between spouses, and that was her area. And she's considered one of the preeminent novelists writing in the English language. So Anne Tyler follows in that tradition, and so she says that more. I like my characters as well. Some of them they're not all, they're not, of course, nobody is perfect, so they're not perfect. They have their flaws. She describes them in all their humanity with all their flaws, but she says, I like my characters and I really they become part of me when I'm writing. So for more than half a century, she has been called by those who enjoy her work, the preeminent American novelist of normal life. So here's this normal life. She's writing in this book, in this little book, set over a period of 3 days. And really it is like, I don't know if you had this feeling when you read it, that it's almost like 3 acts of a play. Not that, and I was thinking about it, this could be a movie, because it really could be a film. It's, I don't know, however filmmakers decide they're going to make this into a film, because the wedding is the main event, but the before and the after, there's enough material in it, except that when she writes, you get so much by her sentences and by her description that I don't think you could get if it was turned into another format such as a movie. So how does she begin? She calls, as I said, so the 3 days. So the first day she calls Day of Beauty. That's the Friday, the day before the wedding. Do you remember how it started? It starts with a question to the reader. People don't tap their watches anymore. Have you noticed? Standard wristwatches I'm talking about. Remember how people used to tap them? Of course, you have to be a certain age to understand what she's talking about because, first of all, I don't know, a lot of people have smartwatches now. Okay, well, actually, they do tap them now, right? But it's for a totally different reason. So she says, and we don't know who's talking about, right? This is how the story opens up. People don't tap their watches anymore, have you noticed? And she goes back to the wristwatch thing again at the almost at the end of the book. Standard wristwatches I'm talking about. Remember how people used to tap them? My father, for instance, his watch was a Timex with a face as big as a 50-cent piece. And whenever my mother kept him waiting, he would frown down at it and give it a tap, implying, I suppose now, can this possibly be correct? Could it really be this late? But when I was a little girl, I imagined he was trying to make time move faster, to bring my mother before us instantly, already wearing her coat, like someone in a speeded up movie. What reminded me of this recently was that Marilee Burton, the headmistress at the school where I worked, called me into her office one Friday morning as I was walking past. Come chat for a moment, why don't we? She said. This was not a regular occurrence. We were on more or less formal terms. She waved toward the Windsor chair facing her desk, but I stayed in the doorway and cocked my head at her. I thought I should let you know, she said, I won't be coming in on Monday. I have to have a cardioversion. A what? I asked. A procedure for my heart. It's been beating wrong. Oh, I said. I couldn't pretend to be surprised. She was one of those ladylike women who wear heels on all occasions, the perfect candidate for heart issues. Well, I'm sorry to hear of that, I told her. And you're right. So just from this little bit, well, this thing with the watch and the tapping and the irritation, but then when she says this is her answer to her boss, who's telling her she's having this cardiac procedure, and she's thinking in her head that, oh, she wears high heels. So, this is like, she did this to herself. This is not, she was a candidate for heart issues. They're giving it an electrical jolt that will stop it and then start it again. Huh? I said, like tapping a watch. This is the relation. Pardon? Is it dangerous? I asked. No, she said, I've had it done once before, in fact, but that was over spring break, so I didn't see the need to announce it. Okay, I said, and how long will you be out of the office? I'll be back on Tuesday as good as new. Anyway, so they have this little conversation, and whoever's talking to us, the assistant to the headmistress of this school, is then she's standing there waiting to be told something, and then her boss tells her on the second page of the story that I'm thinking of handing in my resignation before the new school year begins. This is the end of June. So this woman who's our narrator is saying, the school year would begin in September. We were already in late June. I said, so does this mean I'll take over as headmistress? It was a perfectly logical question, right? Somebody had to do it, and I was next in line for sure. I'd been Marilee's assistant for the past 11 years. But Marilee let a small silence develop, as if I presumed in some way. Then she said, well, that's what I want to chat about. And she calls her in, and so our narrator, whose name we find out is Gail, she tells her a few sentences later, and she says to her, well, you must be thinking of retiring also, Gail. So, and I'm very impressed with this woman who won a certain prize, an educator's prize. And so there's going to be a new headmistress brought in from Nashville. And she would like to have her assistant brought in with her. So in other words, Gail is being told that she will be out of a job. Yeah, this is the end of this. Is like too bad. And Gail is stunned. I mean, she just walked by and all of a sudden she's told this, that you're not going to have your job. But her boss says to her, well, you're 61 years old. You won't be working much longer. And Gail retorts, I'm 61 years old, nowhere near retirement age. And then her boss says to her, this is going to be something that's going to trouble our narrator throughout the rest of the book. It's not only a matter of age, she told. She was looking at me with her chin raised, the way people do when they know they're in the wrong. Face it. This job is a matter of people skills. You know that. And surely you'll be the first to admit that social interactions have never been your strong point. What are you talking about? I said to her. What possible interactions could you be referring to? And then her boss says, well, I mean, you have other skills, of course, but you're very organized, you're a good public speaker, but look just for now, for instance, I tell you I have a heart condition and you say, oh, and pass on right to the question of taking over my job. I said, oh, I reminded her, I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Another one of my strengths is I have a very good memory. What more did you require of me? I required nothing at all, said her boss, and now her chin was practically pointing to the ceiling. All I'm saying is that to head a private girls' school, you need tact, you need diplomacy, you need to avoid saying things like, good God, Mrs. Morris, surely you realize that your daughter doesn't have the slightest chance of getting into Princeton, which is what Gail would say to the mothers, the parents of this very wealthy school where she is the assistant to the headmistress. And Gail retorts by, but that girl couldn't get into a decent trade school. So what was I supposed to say to her mother? Anyway, so this is the opening scene. Gail, our narrator, who we just meet, who asked us about people tapping on wristwatches, has just been told that she doesn't have a job. So, and she's very upset about it. She turns and she leaves the room and she just goes away and she runs out of school and she doesn't go even to get her things from her desk or her sweater, the cardigan hanging in the closet. And she goes into her car and she drives home. And then she says, so we don't know yet what this day is. But she says to us, so I had been planning to stop by the cleaners afterwards and pick up the dress that I would be wearing that evening. It was the evening of my daughter's wedding rehearsal with dinner to follow. But now I couldn't imagine attending even. I pictured sitting in the half-empty church while the rest of the wedding party pointed at me and whispered, poor Gail, they would whisper, have you heard? She was let go at age 61, lacks people skills. Wasn't even consulted about her daughter's day of beauty today at Darlene's spa and massage. The groom's mother set that up entirely on her own. So anyway, she says, never mind that I hadn't even known that there was such a thing as a day of beauty. And that's the first act of this book is going to be called Day of Beauty. So we're introduced to Gail. She goes home. She is stunned by this news that she's not going to have a job, and it's June, at the end of June. So when was her headmistress going to have told her this? Probably that day or soon enough. But it's the day of the rehearsal for her daughter's wedding, which was going to be taking place the next day. And she's very, very distraught. She goes home, she sits in her living room, and she just sits because she's in shock. And then there's a knock at the door, and who comes in? It's her ex-husband, Max. And Max is coming in, and we're introduced to Max, who is very much the opposite of Gail in many ways. He's this large guy, and as she says at one point in the book, he had no boundaries. He's sweet, he's kind, he wouldn't hurt anybody, and he's also a little bit, well, let's say scatterbrained, but he's definitely different from the very uptight, very rigid Gail, who has a lot of boundaries. In fact, by the end of the book, you realize that Gail comes to realize that maybe all these boundaries that are her personality, but maybe they have caused harm to her family and harm to herself. But at the beginning, Max appears and he's coming into the house with a big duffel bag over his shoulder and carrying something, which turns out to be a case carrying a cat. And then he comes, and so he appears, and it turns out that he who was supposed to stay at their daughter's apartment has to stay with his ex-wife, Gail, because he has this cat. And he doesn't want to leave, he can't actually bring the cat to the daughter's house because the daughter's future husband is very, very allergic to cats. And even a little bit of danderon causes problems, so he comes to stay with Gail. So that's the opening scene, and they do. Gail pulls herself together and she does go to this rehearsal, the wedding rehearsal, with her ex-husband. And so the first act takes place there. So it's that day when she's still stunned by the fact that this job that she's had for many years and what she thought was going to happen is not going to happen, and she's out of a job. And so but the description there, we find out a lot about the characters just in that day. They have a beautiful daughter. Their daughter Debbie is a lawyer. She's 30 years old with long blonde hair and very beautiful. And she's an only child. And so she's the apple of her parents' eye. And she's And she is getting married to this guy called Kenneth. And we find out, you remember those of you who read the book, we find out something about Kenneth, that there was some suspicion of infidelity, and her parents are very upset. And how is Debbie going to react to this? So there's a lot of drama going on in a very few pages. So, this is it. When you read Anne Tyler, you think, yeah, she's writing about everyday life and everyday people, but there's a lot going on in her story. And so that section ends. They get through the wedding rehearsal. They come home, and it's a good thing that Max has come to stay with Gail, because she's very upset. I mean, it's the combination of their only daughter is getting married, and she feels she's happy her daughter's getting married, but she's sad that things are going to be different. And not that her daughter was living with her, but just that her daughter will have a different life from now on, and she's really alone. So the fact that Max comes, and he's a nice guy, and they seem to have an amicable relationship, even though they've been divorced for a number of years, and we don't know why they are divorced. And we find that out a bit later, and that also adds to the drama of the story. And this cat. So the cat is there, and Anne Tyler often has pets in her books. There are cats, there are dogs, and in this case, the cat comes in, and Gail says to Max, no, what are you doing bringing this animal in? And he says, well, I have to, and because I foster, I'm the foster parent of this cat, and I couldn't leave her alone because her owner has just died, and she's an old cat, and so I have to bring her here. And maybe you'll adopt her, because we're looking for homes. And she says, no way, no way, no way. I'm tired. I finished that stage in my life where I don't want to take care of anybody anymore, not even a cat. So the first section of the book ends. The rehearsal has gone the way it's gone. They're okay. They make it back home. Max comes back to Gail's house. The cat is there, and remember the end of that first section was Gail goes upstairs to bed, and then Max goes into another bedroom, and as she climbs up the stairs, she says she goes to her room. She plunks herself down on the edge of the bed. She had been hoping maybe their daughter Debbie would call them, just to say hi, to say something on the day before she gets married, and then Debbie does not call, and Gail gets into bed. And then she says, a few minutes later, my door made an unlatching sound, and the vertical line of light at its edge grew wider, and the cat padded in. Her footsteps were clearly audible. That's how heavy she was. She's a fat cat. I felt her dent my mattress as she sprang onto it. But here's what was weird. For one split second there, I thought it was Max at the door. I had felt this stab of outrage. Was there no escaping this man who had no boundaries, which had always driven Gail crazy? Anger feels so much better than sadness, cleaner somehow, and more definite. But then, when the anger fades, the sadness comes right back again, the same as ever. So that's a poignant, that ends the first section. Still don't know what's gone on, why they were divorced. That ends that. End of day one. Day two, as she calls D-Day. Debbie did call, as it happened. She called us on the morning of her wedding day, called Max to be specific. We were in the kitchen.
Hold on, let's turn that off.
At the time, Max was cooking. He was cooking breakfast. He was flipping an omelet, and Debbie called because she wants to say hi, and she finds out that her father doesn't really have anything very appropriate to wear to a wedding. So Debbie is marrying into a family that are more, it sounds like, either more upscale, but definitely more interested in things like how they look and in the niceties of life than Gail and Max, who are very well suited in that way. So Debbie is worried that her father is not going to have anything appropriate to wear. So she comes over on the day of her wedding and says to her parents, I'll be over there at 10 o'clock. We're going to go to a store. We're going to buy Dad a suit. So that's what they spend the morning doing. They buy him a suit, and there's that wonderful scene where they go into Learners, this is the name of the store, discount suits. They find Max a suit, and Max is like, he only does this because he adores his daughter, his one and only daughter. Otherwise, like, what would you spend money on clothes for? Like, this is very silly. Gail too, she's wearing a dress that she had because she's like, So they go and they buy this suit, and he tries on a suit, and the sleeves are too long, but he doesn't say anything, and there's no tailor on premises at this not fancy men's clothing store. So they buy the suit, they come home, but meanwhile, as they say, this infidelity has been found out, where Debbie's future husband something has happened, and now the parents are very upset. Well, not both parents. Gail is very upset at the idea that her future son-in-law had cheated on her daughter right before, not long before he was going to marry her. And she says to her husband, or ex-husband, we have to do something about this. We can't just let her, like, how can she do this? And he is much wiser than her and says to her, it's not our business. She's grown up. She'll deal with the situation, and whatever she decides, we keep our mouths closed and we don't say anything. And he's the wise one here. So, but this is the day of the wedding. And Gail is very distraught about this. So they go buy this suit, and then they go back to Gail's house. And there's a scene there, right there, before they have to leave for the wedding, where Gail is hemming the cuffs of the suit jacket because it's way too long. Max didn't really care how long it was, although he notices that it looks long, so he asks Gail to fix it. And she's sitting there in her armchair, hoping that things are going to work out, very upset that her daughter is marrying this guy who doesn't seem to be very trustworthy, and her husband's advised her not to say anything. How could they go to this wedding? Anyway, they do. The wedding takes place. They go to the church. We even meet Gail's mother. Gail has a mother who sees a pretty smart lady too, who knows what's going on a lot more than Gail gives her credit for, and gives Gail some pretty good advice throughout the story, as she probably had throughout Gail's life. The wedding is described, I mean, it's great, like just the description of the wedding, and then the wedding dinner is held afterwards in a fancy club that the in-laws belong to, and the in-laws are sponsoring this part of the wedding, and then the description of the dinner and the speeches that are made, and the relations between the different characters in the family. Again, we don't know much about them because it's a very short book, and you're not given a lot of detail, but just enough so that you get a feel of what's going on. And D-Day, the wedding manages to go off, and there they are, the parents at the end of the day. Their daughter is married. She seems happy enough, although Gail is still very worried, because really what's going on, and what is her daughter? She's accepted the fact that her husband may have been unfaithful to her, cheated on her, like just before they got married. This is very disturbing to Gail. But her husband has said to her, her ex-husband, Max, has said, just be quiet about this. And so D-Day ends. But we find something out. And again, for a little book with not many pages and not that much description, at the end of D-Day, and D-Day was meant to be wedding day, but it also turns out to reveal something, if those of you who remember the book, that when we get right to the end of it, and Max and Gail are talking at the end when they're rehashing the wedding, and Gail says, you know what, it's kind of nice that Max came to stay with me, because when you come home from a child's wedding, it's nice to have somebody to talk to rehash, how things went, if you come home to an empty house and nobody to talk to. So they're talking, and they're analyzing what went on, or at least Gail is analyzing, and she says to Max, and did it seem to you that Kenneth, that's the name of the new son-in-law, got a little teary there at the end? Yep, I thought so too, says Max, which doesn't for 1 minute mean he's not guilty, of course, of this infidelity that they're debating about. I heard a slamming sound and I lifted my head. Max had just returned his recliner, because Max liked the recliner in the living room, to its fully upright position. Give it a rest, Gail, he told me. Of course he's guilty. I stared at him. Read between the lines, he said. He's guilty, but Debbie forgave him, and now it's over and done with. So you agree that story that he made up, he made the story up, and she chose to believe it. Or she didn't believe it, so he broke down and confessed, and she forgave him. Or, and here's the one I'm hoping for, He confessed right off and she forgave him right off. And then the two of them hatched up that cover-up story together to put on a good face for things. Whichever, it's none of our business. You make it sound so simple, I said. It is simple. And one thing I know for certain is she's sorry as hell that she told us about it and she's hoping we will never bring it up again. I thought this over. So, I said finally, it seems I'm the only one who still holds Kenneth accountable. Right, he said. Ironic, isn't it? Ironic, I said. What? But all of a sudden he got very busy. He stood up and he took a quick slug of his beer and he said, well, I guess I'll turn in now. And he went to the kitchen with his can. When he came out, he said, good night, and headed straight up the stairs. Good night, I said. Ironic, because I hadn't forgiven Kenneth, even though Debbie had, I guessed. But more than that, because I, of all people, hadn't forgiven him. So I went upstairs and I turned the lights. I turned out the lights and I went to bed. So now we don't understand. Okay, then we have the day after, the third and final section of the story. And here is where the author says to it, Sunday morning, day 3, and she wakes up and there's just something next to her in the bed. It's the cat. The cat that she wants nothing to do with. And of course, you know where, or at least you think you know where this is all going. And so now the cat she's sitting on her bed and she thinks to herself, once she comes to after waking up, she says, it's gone, it's over. Debbie's wedding day is over, thank God. And it really all went fine. She was probably still asleep now on this very first day of her marriage. I didn't feel any sense of envy. What person in her right mind would want to go back to being a newlywed? There was just so much she had to adjust to, she and Kenneth both. I was just glad to be past all that. Once upon a time, Debbie had sworn that she would never get married. Back in 5th grade, this was. Never, ever, she had said. She'd have to be crazy to get married. That was my fault entirely. I knew it even then. I had fallen in love with another man that year and torn our family apart. And then you go, oh. So the third section, the day after, and this is all supposed to be the wedding, right? But you're finding out so much more about this family. And it turns out that Gail had had an affair. You remember when she had this affair, and that's why they were divorced, because she has this very brief affair lasting not even 3 months with a teacher in the school that she worked. And her husband found out about it, and then Max was, obviously extremely devastated. He was just, and he moved out and the parents were divorced. And so Debbie had this divorced mother and father. And but she never knew. She never knew what caused it. She never asked details. She never knew. So then Gail comes and we find out more about her. We found out about this affair, and it was, as I said, very short-lived, and Gail regretted it afterwards. She regretted it terribly. But they remain divorced, and when we meet them in this story, they are still divorced, although by the end of the book, and there's a nice ending where you're not sure, because she leaves it in a way that you're not sure what is going to happen, but the possibility is there that perhaps Gail, and Max it seems like he would like to go back to being with her, and we're not so sure what she is going to do. As well as we find out that she has good job possibilities, because that's and towards the end of the book, we also do find out that her real love was teaching. She's a math teacher, and she was a very good math teacher, particularly remedial math, because her thing was, and would you have thought of this of her, but that her real passion was making kids who hated math fall in love with math. And so she's really one of these dedicated teachers, as is Max. But Max doesn't live, by the way, for those who haven't, Max doesn't live in Baltimore. He lives somewhere out of the city. And he works at some school, and he doesn't get very well paid, and he has never, as she says, he's always managed to find himself not very decent paying jobs. Whereas Gail is much more steady, and she's been the assistant to this headmistress of this fancy prep school for girls all these years, until now she is no longer going to do that. But she says at the end of the book, then by the end of the book, Max calls his principal and says, would you like a math teacher? And his principal said, oh my gosh, it would be wonderful to have a remedial math teacher, of course. But she also points out that her headmistress asks at the school, and there would be a position for her to go back to teaching, which was always her first love. So job-wise, things looked up for her at the end of the story. And at one of the last pages of the book, she's talking to Max, and she's agreed that maybe she'll take the cat, and but she's kind of gotten used to this cat and likes the cat. And she says, remember in the old days when people used to tap their watches, as she opened the story with? They still do if they're smart watches, he told me. Those are not watches. Those are computers on wristbands. But a normal watch like mine, I said, why would I need to tap it these days? It runs for years on one battery. Why would you tap it even back then? He asked me. Though come to think of it, my grandfather used to tap his watch when he wanted to point out how late we were. Yes, so did my dad, I said. But I guess it could also mean the opposite, like, is this thing dead? Because I swear I've been at this party for hours, but my watch says it's only 8:30. And Max and Gail, as she says, we were very alike in that we did not like parties. We were always the first to leave, even when we were young marrieds. That's what was known about us. Oh, it's the Baineses. They're always leaving the first. Or also, stop right there, watch. Stop exactly where you are now. Well, I've never seen that one, I said, and I hope it's not in Marilee's case, because they're talking about Marilee and this procedure that she had to have. When Gail says, I remembered, because she forgets what it's called, and there's this little bit of banter between them throughout the book that they can't remember a word. Like, what's this cardioversion? And she can't remember it. Her boss tells her at the beginning and she can't remember it. So that's why she says, oh, I remember it. It was called a cardioversion. And it's a heart we're talking about, not a watch. Anyway, so they have this discussion about, and that's where they say here, haven't these past 3 days, Max says, felt like going backward in time? Like Groundhog Day, I agree. Groundhog Day? The movie, I say to him. Count on Max, he wasn't much of a moviegoer, where people live through the same day over and over again until they get it right. Exactly, Max said. We've been given another chance to get it right. And yet, did we, I asked? You show up to my house uninvited, just the same as when you moved in with me and my roommates, that's when she just says before they got married, you bring in an unannounced pet just as the same as when you brought your dog. It's true, Max said happily, and we even had Jared Johnson, who turns out that the uncle of the groom was an old boyfriend of Gail's, who she was going out with before Max appeared on the scene, and he tries again to make contact with Gail at the wedding and asks if he can call her, and Gail says, for what? And he says, well, to go out for dinner maybe. And she says, I'm not very sociable. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. So then he looks at her and he moves on to some other lady in the room. But anyway, so this is how this, and then the story, they have a nice dinner and Max says, okay, goodbye. They go out for lunch and Max says goodbye and he packs up all his stuff. And because he has to go back to where he lives, which is not in Baltimore, he leaves the cat because Gail says that she's going to take care of the cat. Maybe she'll adopt the cat. And Max goes out. But at the end, he comes back and we have an ending that we're not sure exactly. Are they going to get together or are they not? But Gail has realized over the period of these 3 days, she's realized a great deal about herself. So it's the combination of getting told that she's not getting headmistress position at the very opening of the story, her daughter getting married, this episode of the infidelity of the son-in-law and how her daughter handled it, having Max, her ex-husband, come and stay with her for those days. And all of this has brought back all kinds of memories. And by the end of the story, Gail has done a lot of self-reflection, and perhaps there will be some kind of change, which is what you want to, what's a novelist, a good writer tries to do with a character over the course of a book. And even though, so as I say, even though it's a small book and we feel like we didn't get very much information, we have a lot of information packed into this little story. It's very good, Tyler. It's not one of her long, complicated family sagas, which are also excellent, but it's a little, I think, like a little gem of a story. And she says that, so she finished it, and she says, now I'm working on something else. I did find another idea from my blue box. I won't say, of course, what I'm working on, but as she said, and as I said before, she says she'll continue to write as long as she is able to, and as long as she has material. When she says, of course, there's material, because as long as there are human beings living and I'm able to watch them, and I have my blue box to set me off on the right track, I will continue to write. I just wanted to say, oh yes, I told you that she was married very happily for 34 years until her husband in 1997 died of, her psychiatrist husband died of lymphoma. She herself was diagnosed with breast cancer, but she's been fine. And death and grief, really, they've always been part of her fiction. They are not usually directly addressed, except in the book, The Beginner's Goodbye. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. It's about a man who loses his wife. He becomes a widower, and that one was addressing grief directly. So she says that that she's going to continue writing. She's already at work on her next novel. And she says she always prefers a happy ending, and which, in most of her books. She says she has absolutely no fear of death, rather of living too long. But it does annoy her that there might be unused index cards in the blue box. Maybe that fear stems from her horror of clutter. Or maybe, she says, just that there are so many cards in the box, and I don't think I will have enough years in my life to get through all of them. Does she feel any moral imperative as a novelist? She was asked. No, she says, it just that over and over again, I am really struck by how ordinary people get through their day. Sometimes it almost strikes me as sort of a miracle. The majority of people lead lives of quiet desperation. Some people don't have a lot to hope for, and yet they make do, and on the whole, they behave. They behave very well, which to me is pretty amazing. And that's what she writes about in her books. Any questions? Anybody who read it, like anything wanted to say about it? It's a good little book, right? And it's if you read it again and you look at how much she does pack, it's deceptive because it is short and you feel like you don't, pardon? Yeah, I think it's, and appreciate the sentences. Because there was one sentence, and there were so many sentences, but there was one where the daughter goes this day of beauty, which Gail has never heard of. What is a day of beauty? And she said to her husband, what's a day of beauty? Whoever heard of a day of beauty? I don't think, she never went on anything like this before. And he says to her, Gail, she's never gotten married before. This is the thing that just because you haven't heard of it. And she comes in and Gail describes her, and she says to her daughter, who's very beautiful, she comes in and she's all made up. And when she describes her, she says, I can't find this because I didn't put this spot, that she's beautifully done. Her hair is one shimmering golden sheet that falls straight, and her eyes are this beautiful blue that brings out the eyes. And somehow she uses the word stunning, and it's a very not Ann Tyler word. And I read it over and over again, and then I realized it was because she uses it really in the sense that her daughter never looks like this or rarely looks like this. So that one word is very effective. And this is her language is also a certain, I say nothing fancy, nothing flashy, but every word is carefully. And she says what she does, interesting. She writes longhand, and then I think she types it, and then she records what she writes and plays it back to herself over and over again so that it sounds right, and especially the dialogue. She says there's nothing that irritates me more than when you read dialogue in a book out loud and it doesn't sound right. When you don't read it out loud, you can't, if you were just reading, it's one thing, but when you say it out loud, which I guess, when you listen to books on audio, you get a different feel. So that's one of her methods also, is that she reads her books out loud to herself, or every day when she finishes what she's written. Anyway. Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, because I read the book quite a while ago, there was some tension between her and the in-laws.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, right, so I don't know so much the in-laws, because the in-laws are probably fine. It's Gail herself, like our main character, who's very rigid and as boundaryless as she says her ex-husband Max is. She is very stiff and very very judgmental of other people and feels a bit awkward. So there's this, and this is really, you know, I think it's, if you've made weddings, or depending who the in-laws of your children are and whether you share, you know, tastes or beliefs, or it can be that one side is, so there's this, I don't know if the other side felt anything, but Gail feels very uncomfortable, and she does make these remarks like, oh, well, you know, they're because they're fancier, and the future mother-in-law will know what kind of dress to wear, although she thinks to herself, I hope she doesn't, she's not the kind of woman who will try to outshine the bride and wear something fancier than the bride, or even off-white. And then she says, I have to admit, she wore a perfectly appropriate mother of the, you know, mother of the bridegroom.
I think she wasn't invited to that spa day.
So she wasn't, that's it. Okay, you're right. She was not invited to the spa day. And it's no place that she ever would have gone, because she tells us, I hadn't gone to a hairdresser since high school, because when I last, and she does go though, the day of the rehearsal, that Friday, she goes to the hairdresser, and she doesn't like what the hairdresser does, and she undoes it when she comes home. But why doesn't she like to go to the hairdresser? Because you have to chit chat with the hairdressers, and she doesn't like that, because she can't. So she's not invited. Is she not invited because she never would have accepted or been interested? I don't know, but you're right. There is that, yeah, that's a good point. So, yeah.
Is the third, because
Yeah.
there's a
If there's something, you're right, then how come she wasn't invited? Yeah, it's true. It's true that it was, yeah. And then when she's hoping that her daughter will come over for lunch, or she asks Debbie, what are you doing for lunch? And she says, oh, we're having our makeup done again. And of course, Gail's not gonna have her makeup done because she doesn't do makeup, and they know, but the makeup lady is going to the house, and the future mother-in-law is gonna bring sushi for lunch, you know, and Gail realizes, oh, okay, I didn't know, like, was that a thing that I have thought to call and bring lunch over? She just doesn't, it's not in her, you know, mindset. So yeah, but so it's true, because she really does put, and then the scenes at the church, and who's gonna walk down with who, and then the toasts at the end of the wedding, like she's got all these bits of a wedding done very, very well. But yeah, the tensions are there. And Max is kind of oblivious because he really doesn't care. He would wear that rumpled old sports jacket of his to his daughter's wedding because, you know, I don't know. But she goes and buys him a suit. So, yeah. Any other comments, or those of you who remember her other books, did it, you know, it's, the themes are, you know, as they say, the same. It's family, it's relationships, and here it's a much smaller, because it's on a very small scale. You have just the two parents and the daughter, although Gail has a mother who is a very good cameo figure, because her mother is a smart lady. You know, her mother picks up on stuff, like when they give her mother a lift back and forth to the rehearsal dinner and to the wedding itself. And she says, and she turns around and she looks at Gail and she says, are you okay? And Gail says, okay, it's bothering me. And my mother turned and she faced in front, but her mother knows that something is bothering her, you know, so, but she just has to say it like that, and you get a picture of who this mother is. Or there's a description of her that when the mother comes down and she's wearing this dress, and then she's wearing this little hat with a little like lace piece sticking out, like a bit of Kleenex, as Anne Tyler writes. And her mother is like, sits there, and she says that my mother's dress hung loosely on her because as she's gotten older, she's gotten thinner, but she refuses to buy new clothes because what would I get new clothes for? You know, like I wouldn't wear them enough to make use, because she expected that she was going to die any minute, although she was perfectly healthy. So, you know, just she's got these descriptors that are so spot on, which is her talent, But you see how much she puts in to this little book. And she has, just as Jane Austen had her setting, or other writers had their place, she has her Baltimore. And that's where she sets her stories. And here we have another Baltimore story. Anyway, thank you very much. And too bad it's not 3 days in June or 1 day in June.
Any days in June.
Rainy, any day in June, right?
Yeah.
Okay. See you next month.